All right, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dylan Rodríguez, he, him pronouns. I'm co-director of the Center for Ideas and Society, and I'm a professor in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at UC Riverside. It's a privilege to welcome you all to Care, Repair, and Otherwise, a roundtable with longtime practitioners. I'm grateful to co-sponsor this event as part of Decolonizing Humanism, the programming stream that I very proudly curate at the Center for Ideas and Society. Our fellow co-sponsors include UC Riverside Center for Ideas and Society, the UC Humanities Research Institute, and a multi-campus research program grant via the UC Office of the President. So appreciation to them. Folks, please know this event's being recorded for potential posting on the Center for Ideas and Society and Decolonizing Humanism YouTube channel. We anticipate that ASL interpretation will be available. We're waiting for the interpreters. In the meantime, please feel free to use the captions feature on your Zoom interface. We also have English to Spanish interpretation for folks that need to figure out how to use that. All you need to do is click the icon at the bottom of your screen. It either says interpretation or it says English or it says Spanish. So feel free to make use of that. And thank you to our interpreters. So for those who are unfamiliar, many North American universities include institutional land acknowledgements in the introduction of campus events. So I respectfully refuse to participate in this practice. I joined many others who reject the official version of the land acknowledgement because it has come to function as a normalization of colonial power rather than a meaningful challenge to it. So I want to welcome you instead with an encouragement to embrace the imperative of activating collective serious study and activity that at minimum denormalizes the conditions of occupation, anti-Black violence, and coloniality in and beyond the University of California. I'd like to continue by honoring Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside. Their life work continues to sustain an Indigenous epistemological, archival, and physical presence in this institution that would not exist if not for their foundational efforts. The University of California as a whole is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples on and around what is now the Riverside campus. UC Riverside is inhabited by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is several blocks away from the site where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller not long before I started working here. Her absence is permanent testament to the centrality of anti-Black state and extra-state violence to this institution and the surrounding geography. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which UC Riverside has a cooperating police relationship, is responsible for cruel and frequently fatal conditions in local jails where the vast majority of people held captive are awaiting trial and cannot afford bail. Relatedly, the University of California's police forces have a long, ongoing record of harassing, intimidating, surveilling, profiling, violating, and criminalizing targeted people and communities on and beyond campus borders. I humbly offer these introductory words with a sense of shared obligation. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you all to this precious occasion by calling forward new, old, collective, and experimental efforts to create decolonized, abolitionist, and liberated futures. So welcome. I'd like to continue with introductions of our panelists and send the regrets of our colleague and comrade Sabina Vaught, who's sick today. She's going to be fine, but she's sick today, too sick to come here. And I just want to honor her presence and her preparation and her enthusiasm to be part of this by expressing her regrets. But I also want to just read her bio, even though she can't join us. Sabina Vaught. Sabina Vaught is an educator currently working at the University of Pittsburgh. Her most recent book, The School Prison Trust, co-authored with Brian Brayboy and Jeremiah Chin, considers the particularities of school-prison relations and their undoing in the long war against Indigenous peoples in the so-called United States through protagonist Jake's stories of refusal, self-determination, and liberation. Sabina is grateful to be here in dialogue with such extraordinary people. Again, I communicate Sabina's regrets. I encourage you all to pick up this book. She was going to actually talk about some of the stories in that text today. Connie One is executive director and co-founder of AAPI Women Lead. Connie has published in academic books, journals, and mainstream press, including the collection Anti-Blackness, the journal Critical Sociology, and Elle magazine. She is a co-editor for the anthology Abolition for the People with Colin Kaepernick and Christopher Petrella. She's appeared on Democracy Now!, MSNBC, and NPR. She's a former sex worker and National Science Foundation fellow. She left academia to lead and co-facilitate community-driven research projects on racial gender violence in the state. Damien Sojoyner is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. He researches the relationship among the public education system, prisons, and the construction of Black masculinity in Southern California. He's the author of First Strike, Educational Enclosures in Black Los Angeles, Joy and Pain, A Story of Black Life and Liberation in 5 albums, and Against the Carceral Archive, The Art of Black Liberatory Practice. So welcome to y'all. Really looking forward to this conversation. Full transparency, folks, I've known our panelists for many, many years. If you sense the familiarity among us, it's not an accident. It's not contrived. It's deeply real. So I just want to ensure that folks understand that among us. So here's how we'll proceed. I will offer a kind of a framing question to initiate the conversation. We'll actually just have a dialogue between the three of us. As that flows, I may or may not bring in a second question to push the conversation forward a bit. And then at the latest, by 2 o'clock, we'll open the floor for other folks who are here in attendance to perhaps come on live and engage in the conversation as well. But it'll be a dynamic flow to the conversation. I've encouraged our folks who are here to just think and talk in real time. Okay, great. So the first framing question. The UC Humanities Research Institute, UCHRI, has created this thematic that we're part of today of care and repair. This is the thematic for this year's sequence of graduate student-focused conferences across the UC system. So I've asked all the three of you, in Sabina's absence, the two of you, to convene at this plenary session because I'm interested in having you think and talk among this community of folks about these two terms. I'm interested in how you mobilize these two terms, care and repair, in the context of your research and pedagogical work. So Damien, as you know, I'm thinking about your work on Black Archive alongside your thinking about insurrection against what you call the carceral archive, among many other things. Connie, you've been building and experimenting with a variety of scholarly, grassroots, feminist, abolitionist practices for years and years. Most recently through this community organization that you've co-founded, Asian American Pacific Islander Women Lead. So the first question is this: how would each of you construct a working definition of those terms, care and repair? And how do you engage with these keywords in your critical practices? So Connie first, then Damien, and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone, and thanks UCR and the center in particular for hosting us. Dylan, as always, thanks for bringing us together. I am going to say a couple of things. One is I do hope for this to be a good dialogue between us and everyone else that's in attendance. I know that Dylan, Damon, and I get to have dialogues, but we don't get to have dialogue with 20-something other people. So I think it's going to be an interesting and creative experience as we experiment with these concepts and practices of care and repair. So I'll start off with that. And then I'll come in and I'll say, in full transparency, I don't have a definition of care and repair. I may have some interventions and a repositioning of how we can experiment with care and repair. And in that sense, I bring in a couple of scholars and practitioners who have informed the rest of my points. One is I revisited Saidiya Hartman's work, Scenes of Subjection, and I thought about her huge kind of intervention and definition, or rather, how she helped us to understand injury, who has access to injury. And then also I revisited Wayward Girls, right? So who has access to injury, and then what do people do when they are foundationally, perpetually, systemically disallowed access to injury? And in that sense, Wayward Lives, she talks about experimenting with freedom, right? So I bring in injury and freedom. I say this because when we brought up the concept of care and repair, one of the first things that I said to Dylan, Damien, and Sabina was I was not sure who had access to care. For me, as someone who has left the academia, for me as someone who is a former sex worker, child of refugees, having no clue how to maneuver or even engage in this world or this empire, I know for sure I grew up anecdotally trying to figure out survival. And one of the things that Sadia helped me understand was through chattel slavery, through the Atlantic slave trade, see how much I don't want to say it. Black folks are not allowed injury. And it made a lot of sense to me, right? So if you are not given access to injury, then where does the care come from? What does care look like? Is repair even a option? So I bring these things up because I believe one of the things that Sadia helped us to understand, and for those of us who exist on the margins, we have to first ask, do we have access to injury before we have access to care, right? And then how do we understand what care looks like or feels like? Do we even get to define that for ourselves, right? And then before we can even think about repair, we would have to identify the levels and the structures and the types of harm, suffering, death, destruction that has shaped our lives, our subjectivities, right? Before we even can entertain, let alone experiment with repair. So I say these in kind of macro, but also very intimate levels of understanding these two concepts. And then because you asked us, Dylan, as long-term practitioners, I don't even know, that's very kind to say. I do know that as a long-term survivor of these systems, right? I know that for sure. And I don't mean survivor in our kind of in our mainstream sense. Every day I feel like I'm trying to survive this place, right? I think in my work, I have asked AAPI Women Lead, the organization I helped to co-found, to repeatedly ask ourselves, when we are harmed or if we are causing harm, is repair possible? Or is the option, which should be resistance and revolution, should be simply or more systemically be demanding revolt, which I think is different from repair. So you would first have to ask yourselves as a practitioner and as a person who is hurting or who has hurt others, right, at this kind of practitioner level, what has caused the harm? What is the harm that's been caused? And then is repair the desire? Is repair an option? And if it is not, then what else is there? And would that else or otherwise require revolt? Both intimately, institutionally, and systemically, right? And I say this again, bringing back perhaps like an intimate survivor lens. If someone has harmed me, I ask myself, can I repair this? Or do you just simply need to go? And when I say need to go, I leave that up to the attendees for what I mean by that. So that's how I would play around with those terms. I'll pass that back.
Yeah, can I ask you a follow-up as we kind of think through this together? You just said something really deep that I'm trying to get my mind around, and I need your help. I think everyone else probably would benefit from hearing you talk about this more. You just said trying to survive this place, like a second ago, right? Trying to survive this place. Could you talk about what place or places? You know what I'm saying? Like what places? I mean, it's messing with me, that statement. And I need your help. Trying to survive this place. What place? What are the places?
You know, I really appreciate you asking that, because for me, I thought it was common sense. Um, so I would say at multiple levels, I am trying to survive the United States as an empire. What does it mean to survive this place? And as an empire, what are the structures that define it? And knowing that it is created and maintained through multiple levels of violence, right? And by violence, we mean anti-Blackness. By violence, we mean white supremacy. By violence, we mean white nationalism, multicultural white nationalism, according to your work. Brilliant work. Thank you. By empire and violence, I mean patriarchy, misogyny, ableism. If these are some of the, and heteronormativity, duh. If I were to say that these were the structures that helped to define the empire and its tending institutions and relationships and ethos, then I am constantly trying to survive it as, a queer Vietnamese femme woman who is in alignment and who was taught by Black liberation. Then I'm constantly trying to survive it. And then I also know that this empire extends beyond the US borders, right? I also understand that this empire is a symptom and a agent of, and an apparatus of, and a creator of modernity and Western civilization, which has made itself permanent. So I see myself every day, literally every day, trying to survive this place. And in fact, I left academia as one of its main institutions of violence because I couldn't handle the violence anymore. So I chose to survive you all's place by jumping ship and marooning and leaving. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
That doesn't, so now I'm trying to survive the nonprofit industrial complex, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I just value how you brought survival into this discussion. This care, repair, and then you just brought in survival, and I want to appreciate the really dynamic temporality and geography of survival that you think about here, the way you name empire, but also think about empire both in its intimacies, its nearbyness, and its globality, which is, I think, the necessary analytical practice to think about empire. Because, I think the academic tendency is to use these concepts, which are necessarily abstract concepts, while allowing them to kind of linger in the realm of an alienated abstraction rather than a useful abstraction. That is an abstraction that brings attention to all of these moments and geographies and places in which survival is the mandate, is the imperative. And in this particular moment with genocidal, protracted genocidal, as well as acute and accelerated genocidal Nakba violence happening against Palestinian peoples and Palestinian places, which has been an ongoing thing well prior to October 7th. This I think really rings, doesn't just ring true, but it rings urgently. That's what I should really say. So I appreciate that framing. I'm going to keep thinking through this. Damien, same question. How would you construct a working definition of the key terms for this conference, this gathering, care and repair? How do you engage with those key words, those key concepts in your critical practices?
So I want to echo what Connie said, and thanking you for inviting us here today for this conversation discussion. And also, very sad that Sabina could not be with us, but I understand that she also contributed mightily to our thoughts about how we sort of develop notions of care and repair as well, and wishing her nothing but the best as she recovers also. Now, with respect to care, for me, immediately, I went to two related but temporarily different places. One is in thinking about the dynamics at play during the 1960s and 70s with regards to Black Power movements. And specifically, I'm thinking about the archival collections at the Southern California Library from the Coalition Against Police Abuse Archive, the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party archive, the Mother's Rock Archive, Urban Policy Research Institute archive, and an archive of Clyde Woods as well. And it's very obvious that in the face of multiple forms of state violence against Black communities, that Black people in neighborhoods throughout Southern California had formed distinct modalities of life in a place where life was attempted to be snuffed out at every means possible. And most distinctly, you can see that sort of in the anecdotes that we think today, like the free breakfast programs, the free education programs that were offered as well. And in addition to uh, schools and other state structures being co-opted and taken over by Black organizations as well. And how that translates sort of in day-to-day life is given the fact that the basic necessities of life have been removed from Black life, such as just think about food, like not having access to food in the morning, such like a basic function, and that being supplemented by Black people with the understanding that the state intervention would come at a high cost. So it's more so important that we sort of do this on our own. You sort of saw forms of that immediately pop up in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and people quickly called it mutual aid and forms of mutual aid. And perhaps we can have a conversation later about the critiques of what has been sort of described as mutual aid. But I think importantly for this conversation, it is very, I think, important to note that that type of lived experience, which is the reliance upon a Black autonomous existence within a state structure that demands subservience or death, that in spite of this, these notions of care have to be very well defined and mitigated, or else the level of co-optation then by the state to then be able to define what care looks like can, in fact, reproduce those same forms of violence in which Black communities were distancing themselves from. And I think there's also, possibility to have a conversation about, is that type of formation sustainable within a place, or is it sort of a liminal existence as well? And related to that, since I mentioned these collections at the Southern California Library, it also should be brought, to note that the Southern California Library has done a tremendous amount of work to incorporate the lived sort of their experience of being a collection of sort of radical far left thinking within the neighborhood immediately in which it exists. And to that end, they've held several political education workshops with young people, middle-aged people, old people, the whole neighborhood and gamut. about what it means to sort of exist and live in the contemporary sort of formation of life under the guise and the banner of the carceral state. And when I say the carceral state, immediately people think of policing and prisons, but of course it's much more damning than that with regards to the formation of carcerality as being a bastion of war against Black people. And so since it is that, then you have to think about all forms of life, similarly to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, in which the archives sort of indicate that these same formations that were attacking Black life are at bay, and in some ways their reactionary postures have made them a little bit more lethal um, because they have studied what it is that Black communities have been doing in order to exist and survive and thrive. I use that word thrive in quotes because it too has been sort of taken off in various sinister ways. Um, uh, and as a result, in some respects, the the needs of Black life within that moment of carceral expansion very much are based upon these notions of care, right? But very distinct formations of care. And I would say a care that is very much based in distinct practices of love, and a love that is an unconditional um, understanding and unconditional desire to see your sort of your fellow human be in a place where they can think, a place where they can for even momentarily relax, a place where they can breathe, a place where they can eat, a place where they can just be. Also, this is a place where it's recognized that we are all um, uh, under the same types of forms of violence that are attacking us. And given that is the case, then these sort of assumptions and modalities of how we engage with each other are completely different. So what I mean by that, so the the characterization of, for example, labeling somebody a criminal or saying that person is deviant, all that stuff sort of gets thrown out of the window because the impetus in this case is to try to nurture instead of one which is trying to police or delegitimate or do these other things in which we are taught to do to each other in ways that then reproduce the state. And of course, that looks kind of illogical within the formations of most state structures, right? And so if we just take school, for example, that would go against the grain of what you're supposed to do within like a school setting. We're all sort of primed within this K through 12 model to do just that, right? So it's a going against that grain to the point then that you can understand the desire to then withdraw from these state structures and then sort of I'm adopt Connie's word here into marooning into other sort of lived experiences within Black communities that are hard to name, if not given the names or the monikers that somehow are devalued at best and then made to be siloed in the case of to be placed into the clutches of the carceral state in most cases. These particular entities then foster this notion of love being at the center of it. And when that happens, then um, the sort of the reproduction of life within this ethos is completely different than what we would think of actually happens in Black communities. And so that completely goes against the grain of what the state identifies as care. And so I bring that up because these notions of care that are sort of produced and reproduced within Black communities have been made to the point so illegitimate and so illegible. That's what I was looking for. That any attempt to try to bring them into a state structure then is rendered uh, at best, it's rendered something that is won't flow within that context, right? But in most cases, is rendered as being dangerous, right, to the state apparatus. And uh, the as just as a quick anecdote to think about that, our colleague and comrade Orisami Burton has a wonderful new book called Tip of the Spear, which details many of these processes that Black radical thinkers, activists, people who are in the struggle against the expansion of prisons, against jails, against the carceral state, in particular in New York and looking at Attica, had sort of formed together ways of being that would then overthrow and dismantle the state. And this book is phenomenal. This book also has been banned by the Prison Institute in New York as well, right? So in terms of thinking about the ways in which these practices are made to be dangerous and cannot be implemented as such, when they detail the level of care that in fact took place within Black communities becomes an imminent threat then to the state. And so in its place, what we see is that care becomes packaged, reformed, commodified as sort of like this Hallmark greeting card that can be sold at the halftime of the Super Bowl as a way for the state to sort of step in and then be benevolent, right? But of course, the state is taking bits and pieces always of because it's reformist, and the goal of the war sort of praxis is a reformist goal in terms of co-optation, but that violence is also critical to that process. That the reproduction of said violence then has to not only erase those same uh, ideologies and forms of being, but then also has to go that extra mile of co-optation of beings. And in this way, I'm thinking of Fanon's black skin sort of white mask, those co-optations of being to then ensure that one goes against one's own collective interest in the name of the reproduction of the state. And so you can see that at the university level, when these sort of major policy endeavors, these major acts of benevolence take place. Oftentimes, I mean, it was huge after the George Floyd murder, and universities across the whole country sort of were tripping over themselves to show how much they cared about Black people and Blackness, right? But to the extent that most of it was rhetoric was on one hand, but then there was countless ways in which the reproduction of those formations of anti-Blackness were reproduced by the very policies, as you saw these positions being created, these administrative positions being created, these faculty positions being created, just as placeholders for other white academics to come in and to be hired and to sort of do the good work of liberalism. This was on sort of like a mass scale, or to have Black interlocutors of the state to come in to do that same work uh, in the name of being able to demonstrate to this imaginary public that they being the universities were acting as good agents of sort of quote unquote change. At the same time that this is all happening, you can see the attacks upon higher education are swiftly mobilizing to the extent that, where we have the situation in Florida right now, where the notion of Black people being admitted into institutions of higher education is a serious question now. It's no longer like an existential threat that's at play. Like this is where we are in this moment, right? Now we can also talk about the limitations and the problems of higher education, but I want to put that, I'll leave that right there to think about where this all came from in the first place. So we think about back to these archival moments, and we think about how Black power organizations in the 1960s as a strategy would mobilize within institutions of higher education, right? So you have the Black Panther Party, you have us organizations who are actually actively, as a strategy, saying that we're going to take over these universities, we're going to take these resources, and it's going to be part of a larger framework that then is going to incorporate our neighborhoods, our communities, our understandings of what the state owes us, and put it into a much larger practice. Somehow we have moved from that moment of understanding to this other moment of creating positions where you have, as I mentioned before, interlocutors of sort of the state to be able to come in and articulate what it is that's needed in the form of care, right? And so that modality of cooptation is very dangerous, because once it takes place, it's very hard to see, because all of these state structures have formed to make it look seamless and it looks natural. And this becomes a major issue, right? So I think it's unpacking all of that, and then also, to throw out the question: is that still a strategy that would be effective? And how can we mobilize? Can we still use bits and pieces of it with understanding its limitations? And I think with regards to repair, this is for me, it's quite simple, right? Like you can't have repair until you completely undo everything that's been done in the first place. And what I mean by that, I mean that's a very sort of like simple, I think, abolitionist type praxis, which there has to be a massive reckoning and undoing of everything that the state has worked toward. And to that end, if you understand that the goal of the state is to reproduce forms of racial capitalism on a sort of day-to-day lived level, and that's articulated by these state structures, then of course you have to undo all of the state structures in order to begin to understand the notions of repair. And then we can have a conversation about what's needed on a day-to-day lived experience level. But until we get to that point, it's very difficult to have these notions about repair. As Clyde Woods, who many of us had the pleasure to meet and talk with, he often would say that's like sending in the circus to put out a fire, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense at all, unless you want a spectacle, unless you want a show, in order to say like, oh, we're doing these sort of great things. Now that's on like I think on a state level, right? But I think if looking at it within our own lives, the interpersonal context, then I think there's much that could be done about repair. I just don't know, and I'm very hesitant about what can be done in terms of bringing that interpersonal dynamic, that work that, for example, much of Black feminist scholarship, Black feminist movements are indebted to, which is this notion of repair, and that's based in any ethos of love. I'm somewhat hesitant of discussing that as strategies to then be moved into this next level of like how that can be adopted by formations of the state to then think about how we can sort of form with each other. I very much think that it's models that can be followed by organizations. When I say organizations, I'm not thinking about the nonprofit sort of sector. I'm thinking about organizations that already are organic, in particular to Black life. So I feel like I've been talking for quite a bit, so I'm going to stop right there.
Yeah, let me reflect on something and throw it back to Connie, if that's okay, and then maybe the two of you can think about this together. So there's one particular thing that you said earlier on, Damien, that meshes and I think instigates another discussion between the three of us, and that is, you said what Black folks understood during the particular period of time you were talking about in well the distended time, right? I'm not compartmentalizing the distended time of Black life, in which basic necessity is constantly under threat, it's constantly negated and exploded, is constantly and purposefully withdrawn in all kind of ways, and how it's addressed. Those necessities are addressed within Black communities and socialities. And this is what you said, with the knowledge that state intervention comes at a high cost. So I want to stay with that for a minute, because the way that you elaborated the tactics and frameworks that the anti-Black state will use um, to capture those forms of Black sociality and life making, and frankly, life preservation, um, uh, are relentless, right? Those technologies of co-optation are relentless. And so, Connie, I heard you saying something that is alongside this, but I want to stay with this notion of state intervention coming at a high cost and ask you to talk about how API Women Leads work comes up against that, or some versions of that, in a similarly, unforgiving and constant way. So yeah, do you think you could talk about that a little bit, and then I'll throw it back to you with something else, Damien?
I think I can try to to answer your question, but I'll probably do it indirectly. I think as an organization, we were created in part because I like I said, I couldn't handle the university and academia. I wasn't familiar with its logics enough to enter it in a way that would feel healthy for me or sustainable. And so as we became an organization that works to end violence, right, against Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, women, girls, non-binary communities, I say this as like a tagline, right? And I say that as a part of of trying to make comprehensible and legible the work that we do. So that goes back to your question, what's the state got to do with my everyday workings? AAPI Women Lead is informed by Black radical politics and other, queer feminist of color scholarship and movement work. We also were created, actually, we became much more public facing, as people call it, because there was a period a couple of years ago by which the state, including the media, including Hollywood influencers, decided, and organizations, big nonprofit organizations and academics, decided to term the violence that was going on in our lives as hate. They called it Stop API Hate, right? Mind you, in my research and scholarship, I understand hate to come from the concept of hate to come from an actual anti-Palestinian organization and organizing. I'll leave that up for another conversation if you all choose to want to have that. But that concept, especially as a state term and concept, was derived from an anti-Palestinian national and global organization. Now, the US state also uses hate, right, for the purposes of criminalization, prosecution, conviction, in order to individualize its responses and also to individualize people's understanding of violence, which is also to politicize it in a way that is state-centered, state-based. So API Women Lead emerged a couple of years ago to counter that narrative, to expand the definitions of violence against our communities, to name and to counter what is understood as hate. We began naming things like imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy, xenophobia, homophobia, heteronormativity, the United States, right? We were naming these violent apparatuses and conditions as the purveyors of violence, but also our existence here in the US and globally. The state, that has also made it very impossible to navigate in the world, despite our political, not because of our political objective, we have to dodge co-optation. right? Because people are now writing reports using some of our language, right? So API Humanities has this framework informed by Black feminism. We say structural violence, we say institutional violence, we say interpersonal violence, right? And then Stop API Hate, which is led by a university professor and huge nonprofit entities. Now they say structural hate, institutional hate, interpersonal hate, and have completely co-opted it. Right? Mind you, they're also funded by the state, and I would say are the state. So the state does not only, I would say API Humanities is constantly dodging intervention, dodging co-optation. We're constantly maneuvering these minds, right? And I've said this to you all. I've been invited to the White House. I've been invited to speak on MSNBC, also with anti-Palestinian organizations. And I've declined these invitations. I've abstained from these invitations because I am understanding that you want to fold my politics in. You want to DNI me, right? You want to diversify diversity and inclusion me, right? In order to co-opt, to reform, right, to use what Damien is naming, co-opt, reform, to neutralize us and to extract and to use me, right? So if I go to the White House, you're going to have me in these photos, and I would have completely undermined my 40-something years of political commitments for, this, exactly, for counterinsurgency. I understand that, right? But many people don't, because the state has made itself this entity and this goal. Damien also has taught me and reminded me, it's what is the intuition of its subjects is to want to be recognized by the state, right? But because I was taught and learned from, again, Black radical politics, and from, my family who are survivors of, the US war in Vietnam, or a great grandfather who was killed by the French in fighting against imperialism, I cannot, I won't. I don't look to the state, right? The kids nowadays call it pick me girl, right? Pick me. I will not be one of its pick me girls, right? So I think that's important, because that intuition that Damien helped to name for me, that I am counterintuitive or countering, is learned. It's learned in resistance to what the state has cultivated as our intuition. And I actually want to rephrase that. I don't know if it's learned, it's been neutralized. There's that intuition that gets neutralized by the state, and it reshapes it. It capitalizes off of our needs for whatever it is that we may need. It takes it and it folds it into, we'll give you a grant, right? We're going to give you some money for your, food program. So it uses our needs, and it helps, and then it appropriates and it co-ops it, and then your whole political agenda is neutralized, per Damien's point earlier, which was there was an objective at a point where Black communities, Black politics was to take over the university, right? And it made me think, Damien, about the universities in Gaza, right? And how Israel has decimated these institutions, and how Palestinians are saying this was the place where this is where our knowledge, our legacies, our traditions, and knowledge is not separate from our ontologies. It cannot be, right? Or our legacies, our beings, our cultures, this version of humanity. I read what Damien is saying as Black politics was to say, we're going to go into these universities, we're going to make these universities ours. And I've heard Damien say universities are sites of struggle. I hear Dylan say it, but I hear Damien in particular, who studies, schooling, and whose family is a legacy of educators, right? This is the site of constant struggle in empire. And I see them, the state, as you named, is reformist, and it is, what is the word? It is not just perpetual. I almost said homicidal. It is, it's hell bent. I'll just say that, right? I don't have another word, but it is hell bent on taking you in and swallowing you up. That's what it's good at. Right? And so you do have to be careful. But because it's hegemonic, and like I said earlier, it's made itself permanent structure. We are permanently under siege. I'm not going to be upset with people if they seek that shelter because the state made it such, right? I won't be mad at you for seeking shelter, but I will be mad at you for acquiescing your power. I'll be upset because you don't have to do that. You actually don't. You can go run in and grab some food and go and leave, right? I also say it this way. When I was in Vietnam this past spring, I got to, just study. And there was this one house in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. This house where this one man, he single-handedly was the bunker for all of this artillery, all the weapons. Single-handedly took care of this house that looked like just like this little narrow hall. And in that I learned, I said, I was asking the person who was keeping it, like how he managed to smuggle in all of these weapons to their state, to I think it was the capital that he helped to take over. And they said he actually worked for the US. So they never checked him because he worked for the US. And I said that and I thought, oh shit. In the United States, people work for the state because they actually are a part of the state. They're not in there trying to be insurgents or spies. They're in there because they're trying to be in a part of the state, which is very different from what this man did under warfare. I bring that framework here because I hear, the question, Dylan's question, I hear Dylan's work around warfare. I hear, Damien's critique of the state and how it swallows people up. And I think back to this soldier who, again, was a bunker for he would, I'm going to, but the point was he was he was a spy. So when you're in these institutions, graduate students, friends who are on the call, are you a spy or are you just a state? So you got to be clear about that. And I know this is on Zoom, great. UCR, excellent. But we all get to be clear.
Let me work with the old man as bunker parable, which I very much enjoy. So let me say I really love the old man as bunker parable. Let me put it back to both of you this way, and I'll start with you, Damien. Then maybe the two of you can ask each other something if you like, and then folks that are here, we're going to turn it out to the rest of everybody in a second. Okay, I got to ask this, but Damien, in your initial comments, you talked about there's no possibility for repair unless you undo everything that's been done in the first place. All right, so both of you have given us some gems. Let me just honor that first of all. You've given us some poetry. I appreciate it. Everyone here appreciates it. But Damien, all right, and you talk about the need for a massive reckoning and undoing. And I think you're very generous when you say that abolitionists want that. I think that might be a little too generous, actually, right? And I know you and I agree on this. I know three of us agree on this to a significant extent, if not completely. I actually think there's an unwillingness. I think there's an unwillingness around the massive reckoning and undoing. And here's the question I want to turn back to both of you, and I'll start with you, Damien. that massive reckoning and undoing, I am suspicious that if and when care and repair are thematics, if and when care and repair become a mission statement or a long-term political position, that there's a deferral of the massive reckoning and undoing. That worse than that, it leads to a kind of liberal magical thinking that the massive reckoning and undoing are actually not necessary. And we can lean on notions of either permanent triage and a kind of abstracted notion of institutional transformation, which may be based on completely wrong premises. I say all this with full transparency that I think I used to subscribe to a certain kind of magical thinking about my place of work, the university, which I no longer subscribe to. Right. I no longer think that way about the university. But Damien, Damien and then Connie, could you talk a little bit about the massive reckoning and undoing? It doesn't, you can move with what I just shared, but you don't have to. I just want to get your thinking on this notion, the necessity, the mandate, the reckoning and undoing mandate, the necessity of it.
Sure. And maybe I was trying to see if I could build off of what Connie had just mentioned in response to your previous question as well. So I'll try to do both as we're thinking through this. I think that the necessity is there given the function in particular of these state structures, right? Which is, I'll take a basic one, which is education. So if you look at the history, if you look at the contemporary reality and how that history informs the contemporary reality of education in this country, as being a site established by the state with a pure intent to reproduce forms of racial capitalism. And what I mean by that is literally to make class look real when such a thing is imaginary, to make race look real, to make gender and sexuality, all these things are a part of the function of education. Now I can talk the next 3 hours about how that happens, but if you just look up any good book, any good article by Dr. Connie One here, by Sabina Vaught, and maybe we could have a list of resources as well that go through this in terms of William Watkins probably lays it out the best in terms of understanding what the history and function of education are in this country. And then you look at the ways in which the carceral state has been implicated as a site of control in using schools as a major agent to do that. There's no way in the world then that you can move forward unless you then undo these massive state structures which have been put in place to be the purveyor of violence against Black life, right? So that is sort of like the baseline to understand how it is that this undoing and this reckoning has to take place. I think where, in my own thinking, in my own discussions with you all, I try to think about the ways in which non-reformist reform could be used at play, right? To understand how the state can be used against itself without calling it a victory per se, right? And I think we're so far down that sort of line of thinking that it's a little bit scary, right? Because just sort of dipping your toe into the world of abolition these days is not the same place that it was 20 years ago at all. And I suspect that much of this has to do with the fact that so much of these reforms that have been sort of brought in place with regard to the expansion of prisons have been the work of a massive propaganda campaign in order to completely undo the sort of longstanding traditions of Black radicalism that brought it to where it was. And so as Connie was thinking, as Connie was talking, I was thinking, is it possible to do both of these things at the same time? Which is Specifically, there was a raid on the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party on 41st and Central. The only way that the brothers and sisters were able to survive that raid by the LAPD, which used a war apparatus of tanks and large weaponry, was the fact that members of the LAPD had members of the Black Panther Party had infiltrated the LAPD, and they knew that the raid was coming. And Geronimo Jajiga, who had also been trained in the U.S. Armed Forces with the intent to then use that training to then carry it back to Black organizations, then had trained the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party to be prepared for such an event. And as a result, none of them were killed. This is in spectacular contrast to what had led up to many of these other raids in which most people were being shot and killed, right? All over the place. And so as that's sort of a spectacular moment that has been sort of left aside in history, right? But I think it's very instructive to think about how, as much as the state infiltrates Black organizations, I think we have to also understand that Black organizations have also infiltrated the state. You could call it a using the state for its own purposes of life. But importantly, to that point, it is, I think it's very important that we just don't throw away the state without figuring out first how to use the state in order to get to this next point that we need to get to. And that's where I struggle with trying to move on, because, in practical means, many of the public facing sort of sentiments by many Black power organizations were not radical in their day, right? Like, no, there's many critiques that were lobbed at the Black Panther Party, for example, as being sort of too centrist, as not being pushed far enough, right? In the sort of current moment, we look at the Black Panther Party as being some sort of far left-wing organization, when that in fact was not the case within its sort of its day, so to speak, right? And so, given that, which is why I say, I sort of wrestle with what Connie had pointed out, which is taking over these state structures. Is that possible? Is that even a goal that we should have? Or should we move on to something else, right? And is that something else a complete undoing then of these institutions at the same time? Now, how that is done, I think, is going to require a lot of work and strategy in order for it to be implemented. But the reason why I'm so skeptical of using these institutions is to the length and the reactionary posturing of the state. And we think about like the carceral state, how far the carceral state has extended its clutches into the university as a way, as a formation of apparatus and control, is much more advanced than, say, 1972, right? Like, there's whole ass departments which are just geared for the production and the reproduction of the carceral state as sort of as we know it. But then if you think about the philosophy and praxis of what gets produced and reproduced, there are countless departments outside of those departments which reproduce that same logic, which we had talked about previously, which is, of course, the basis of anti-Blackness, but it gets reproduced and produced and reproduced and produced. At the same time that is happening, and this is where I'm trying to wrestle with that, right? The rewarding of people who articulate the goals and ambitions of the state through an adaptation of reform is happening simultaneously as those who are actively resisting the clutches of the carceral state are being even further entrenched within its grasp. So these two things are happening simultaneously at the same time. Reform is being sort of put forward at the same time that the state has even further its clutches, right? So the irony behind Black Lives Matter within LA of sort of pushing this public agenda of doing like the work of the Lord at the same exact moment that Black people in South Central LA are suffering some of the worst forms of structural oppression, of lived oppression. How can these two things exist at the same moment, right? How can people sign movie contracts, get book deals at the exact same moment where people are literally catching hell and need the basics of life? And this is where I'm trying to reckon with these things in terms of thinking about the state and its extreme violence that takes place as people attempt to adopt modalities sort of state life. But then also thinking about that has to be part of the praxis as well. Like you can't just disregard that as a way to maneuver and get by. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Let me share something else that I think echoes what you're saying. By the way, folks that are here in attendance, if nobody raises hands or puts something in chat that they want to, that they want to articulate to folks, that's cool. The three of us will just keep talking. So if y'all want that, that's fine as well. So I'm not trying to cajole you to raise your hand if you'd rather just listen. I'm happy to keep talking to my close comrades here for another 17 minutes. Let me share something that adjoins with some of the stories y'all have told and with the larger narrative of our conversation. Damien, you just made me think about the memorial service for former Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army political prisoner Mutulu Shakur. There was a memorial for him in LA this past summer, and I was really humbled and honored to be invited to come. So I went. I got there, and I'm both glad but somewhat sad that I missed an incident that took place right before I got there, which is this Mutulu Shakur, right? Longtime political prisoner, right? I mean, this is somebody who was actively engaged in Black liberationist counter warfare against a US state apparatus that had accelerated and politically justified by way of propaganda its intent to exterminate Black liberation movements during the latter 60s into the early 70s. So Mutulu Shakur is one of the people who was on the targeted end of that state mobilization. So he passed away. There's this memorial service in Los Angeles this summer. And the LA mayor, Karen Bass, showed up at the memorial service. She apparently gave some kind of boilerplate words and left. And the reason I raised that is, number one, because it was appalling. It was just reprehensible, particularly because the mayor, I think the previous week, had just signed the largest budget increase in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, right? To massive criticism from Black progressive, even reform, not to mention left organizations in LA and beyond LA. So I think we are in that moment where somebody who is actually an administrator, an executive administrator of the carceral apparatus, meaning the policing apparatus in this case, the anti-Black policing apparatus in particular, will show up at the memorial service of a guerrilla liberation fighter who was incarcerated for multiple decades and who was killed by it, right? In the long sense of killed by, right? So I'd like us to sit with that and to continue thinking about the undoing and the reckoning. Connie, I know I know that you've been thinking about this for a long time. So can I ask you to also reflect with us on this notion of the relationship between care, repair, and then this massive reckoning and undoing?
I appreciate that story, Dylan, because here in Oakland, there is a monument sculpture of Huey P. Newton, and that revealing, or that the sculpture's public display, or whatever it's called, ceremony, something, that was about 1 or 2 years ago. It's a beautiful sculpture. The Huey P. Newton Foundation was also there. A lot of people gathered in the rain. And one of the people who spoke was Mayor Liberty Schaaf, who is this white woman that is probably one of the most racist people I've ever really just watched, who was responsible for the destruction of Oakland as it is in today's sense. And she spoke and she used the vernacular. She said hella. She does all these hellas, right? that you know, granted she speaks and then it's crickets, right? Like no one claps for her, but there was an audacity to it, right? There was a kind of you know, I feel like it was what they do is you know, it's state, but also it felt like they were like they're desecrating something that is very important to us in that. And I want to name that as desecration. And that's okay for us to say too, right? Like it's co-optation, it's all the things, and then you're also just desecrating. You're also just marking your territory on our things. And I think we can name it as that kind of obscenity. That way we can name them as perverse and then not in a good way. You're obscene. You're desecrating on a monument of ours. And that repositions, I hope, repositions us in terms of a quote unquote undoing or a reckoning, right? I think about this because I'm big on repositioning ourselves. I've noticed this multiple times as I try to survive and theorize and understand this place. I am thinking about, you know, I have these books with me. There's a book here that I point to a couple of times in the past year or so. It's by Shira Hassan, Saving Our Own Lives, a Liberatory Practice of Harm Reduction. And one of the great things that Shira does is she repositions what we call the, you know, what we've called the deviant. And in that, she identifies people who are, she names sex workers, drug users, people who are addicts, people who are drug dealers. And in a very simple, overly simplified synopsis, I'd say she says, we, and I say that myself as someone who was a sex worker, we are trying to figure out how the fuck to live here, how to survive here. And I would prefer that people in the world, including myself as a former academic, but definitely perpetually a scholar, right? I would really love it if we supported the rest of us who have no clue, but are doing our whole ass bests to figure out how to survive here. And in ways that the dominant discourse, in ways that the state may render incomprehensible. You may not understand why some of us are addicted to drugs, but you can understand that we're doing our best to survive here and may need to numb ourselves, right? I would prefer that as those of us who think through care, repair, state violence, all these really important concepts and things, otherwise, whatever, right? That we really have the backs, to say colloquially, but also as a strategy, as a part of undoing the state, to have the backs of the people who are literally trying to figure out how to maneuver here, right? It makes me think back to Sadia's work I mentioned earlier, Wayward Lives. And this concept that stood out so beautifully for me was experimenting with freedom. If you're under perpetual foundational captivity, if your being here is forever under capture, you are going to have to experiment with freedom and not even have it. You're not going to ever have it. You have to resign to that. So, because if you're here, and I'm not saying that as like an acquiescence, I'm saying as a condition. And if that's the condition of existence here, then you are perpetually, ideally, hopefully, as a survival strategy and political strategy, constantly trying to figure out how to live here in ways that may be very incomprehensible to people. Because it should counter the logic of this place. If the logic of this place is coherence, it makes sense if you're always incoherent. because our logic of the deviant, right? And I don't conflate the surviving anti-Blackness with other people of color's experiences. I'm clear about this. I want us to position ourselves in a way where we understand and have sympathy and care for the beings who are trying to repair themselves as the survivors of this place. Right? That isn't to romanticize. That is to say, wow, this place must be really fucked up. Right? And then what is it that everybody needs to repair themselves, or to even be, let alone repair, to be in this place, right? It requires an undoing, not of just the institutions, but of our understandings and our commitments to this logic, to the reason, right? To the reason of modernity, to the reason of civilization, to the reason of decolonial humanism, to the reason of humanism, right? As Western philosophers, Hegel and the like, shaped our beings into. We have to divest, but more importantly, reposition ourselves as the authorities for how to survive here. And if the choice is to, choose to be in the state apparatus that is the university, be clear that that is your intention. But be clear, if you are a political strategist and if you are of, wanting to undo the systems, be clear that you're constantly going to have to maneuver minds. Make sure that you understand them to be minds, and don't think of it as if you are, someone said to me, if you're not in these positions, someone else will be, right? Make sure, and I say that anecdote because you want to make sure that you see these places as minds and as sites of violence and as weapons that are being shot at you, versus you acquiescing to the systems and just becoming an agent of the state. Remind yourself that you're a survivor and a victim of the state and constantly, maneuvering around its minds. Don't decide at some point you're going to pick up the gun and start shooting your own, right? So I think I say that because that has to be how we understand the undoing, right? I think this too, going back to, I think one thing that I picked up real quickly was Sadia's work, where she says in the chapter redressing the pained body, right? I think there's something that she emphasizes in naming and recognizing the pained body. And on a quote, and I'll read it real quickly, she says, it is precisely through the recognition of the amputated body in its amputatedness, in the insistent recognition of the violated body as human flesh, in the cognition of its needs, and in the anticipation of its liberty. In other words, it is the ravished body that holds out the possibility of restitution, not the invocation of an illusory wholeness or the desire to return to an originary plenitude, right? There's something in that says you get to be real about the amputatedness, the amputations of this place, and move from that place as your logic for how you survive this place, versus pretending that you could ever really be whole here. The undoing is to say, this place is trying to kill me. So you don't have, you get to, I guess, go back to my point, which is I'm constantly trying to survive this place. So you get to own that reality and then name this place as your site of captivity.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to invite one of our attendees to come on live. Sarah Milks Espinosa. Hope I'm pronouncing your middle name properly. Why don't you come on live? I know that Sarah has posted a comment and question in the chat as well, but go ahead and unmute yourself and come on and ask us, and then we'll do a little outro after that, because I know we're starting to run up on time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is the most productive question for the conversation because it circles back to academia, but like thinking about Connie's experience of leaving academia also. So my thought is more, Fred Moulton has like this posture of the university as this place that is both cannot be reformed. That's pretty much the holding of empire, and at the same time is this place of refuge for certain people. And this is really like it sounds really cool and nice and all, but also he's also been pretty rewarded institutionally. This is something that has like kind of created a bunch of awards and stuff from many different places. So it's very comfortable with this model of being a thief at university. And then on the other end, there's Sarah Ahmed, who uh, maybe had an approach where it was like, okay, let's try to make a complaint against the university for sexual assault on the students, sexual misdemeanor of professors. And then she got pushed out in her process of kind of pushing back against the university. So I was just curious what you think about these two models of like what happens to these kinds of approaches of maybe resisting care, not sure of repair or reform. Yeah, that was kind of where I was trying to get.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Did you all want to think about this as a kind of beginning of a closing? Go ahead,
I
Dave.
guess I could, okay, so the best way for me to think about, not so much as like I don't think that the way that the question was situated was attempting to make these like two distinct and different types. And at least unless how I read it was that it was there are multiple formations in which you can engage with university or not engage with the university, and Moulton and Ahmed were used sort of as models to understand that. And in an attempt to link that back then to these notions of care and repair, I think it would be instructive and strategic, at least how I have seen it best work and operate, is that there has to be a connection to something outside of the university, and that too, in large part, is connected with formations of Blackness, right? So we're talking about Black communities, Black struggle, Black movements. That then, if you are to launch yourself into a struggle against university, there has to be something outside university that's going to be the base of support to then allow that struggle to actually exist. I think it's very important to be very clear about what the motives are, and in terms of if you are to launch uh, a complaint or attack or an assault upon the university, what are the goals? The goals may be I don't plan to work here anymore, so X, Y, and Z is then my goal. The goal may be that I need to name what these forms of violence are, and thus in doing so, I may have a job here, I may not have a job here, right? The goal may be that I need to understand um, what it is that these movements need of me within this space to then operate fully within sort of like the larger praxis as a whole, right? And the reason why I'm sort of like just naming all these things is I don't think we could have like a blanket model that exists. Each situation is completely different. Each sort of like regions matter a big time. We really didn't get into a conversation about that, but regionally is very vital, very important to understand the ethos of that region and how it operates and forms as well. But I think as a whole, I would say that individual actors cannot exist within the university state. It, in in with the intent and the goal of like actually changing the university. Like that's impossible to happen. You can't organize within the university with the intent to change with the university. Like it has to happen outside of that space.
Thank you. Thank you. Connie, go ahead. And then I'll close this out.
Okay. I'm gonna speak indirectly again. I think what comes up for me is there are some of us who are going to be able to survive the university, since the university is the institution that's been named. Some of us are going to be able to survive the institution, that site. Right now, it looks like my friends, my colleagues, my comrades are Dylan and Damien as examples. That doesn't mean that they are unscathed, right? They're constantly maneuvering what I said were the minds, and they're able to do so. What I think is very important is that Dylan, as an example, consistently comes to me and says, look, you're not in the university and you're a scholar. I want you to come back and talk with everyone still. And or I'll hold events that are not of the university. Mind you, I now pay my colleagues and my teammates, our research institute, we are paying people to learn how to do qualitative research. That's how we usurp the university, by the way. Anyways, I bring Dylan into these conversations, right? I bring Damien into these conversations. That's per Damien's point, you have to have relationships outside of these walls. But what's important for me, and I hear that Ahmed was squeezed out. We all have to have each other's backs across these institutions, across these battle lines. It is really hard to survive outside of the university's pension, y'all. I'm gonna have to say, I take a huge risk. People say to me, you're so brave, right? And I'm like, you all are brave for staying. And then I also know I'm consistently hustling. I'm hustling for my team. I'm hustling to pay bills for my staff, right? I'm the people who maroon will need you all's backups as you are able to survive the university. Wherever we are, if we understand this to be warfare, we're going to be squeezed out in many ways, in many places, but we have to build a front by which we have each other's backs across these sites if we are to actually survive a perpetual, protracted war. Dylan and Damien, even in this site right here, or even, I see you all in the chat, we come from different positions. We're all here in this one space. Our jobs, our positions are to take care of each other as we experiment with freedom. And the university may kick you out, but you can do something else. But the people who can survive these institutions, their jobs will be to have your backs because they can survive there. And then you have their backs wherever you're able to survive. I feel like those are how I would address the question. And a part of I would just say that's what I'd close on.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me just close with this point. For people who are targeted by colonial warfare, by anti-Black warfare, and all of their variations, if you don't embrace the massive reckoning and undoing, the state is going to bring it onto you anyway, right? And folks know that, So I want to just honor this precious time we've had with Connie and Damien by just acknowledging how they have spoken today in a moment of interstate mobilization that is instigating and legitimating the accelerated destruction of Palestinian life being in place. So I take their thoughts and their words in that urgent, momentary, though also protracted context. And I thank them both. Folks, please join me in thanking. Feel free to unmute and yell at them and scream and clap and all that kind of stuff. And I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of today's conference. Yes.
Thank y'all. Appreciate y'all.
Appreciate y'all. Thank you for coming through. Yo, thank you for coming through, everybody. I know it's the middle of a Friday. This has been beautiful. Thank you all. Okay. All right. Care and repair in the most radical ways, everybody. Peace.